The road was long, dusty, and unforgiving. Heat shimmered off the dirt path as if mocking the weary traveler who trudged along it. Her shoes, worn down to almost nothing, scraped against the uneven ground, and the hem of her dress, once white, now little more than a tattered rag, clung to her legs with the weight of dust and sweat. Each step felt like a battle, not just against the road, but against despair itself. She had been walking for days with no clear destination. It didn't matter where she ended up anymore. All she wanted was a scrap of food, a drink of water, and a patch of shade where she could rest her aching body. Hunger gnawed at her belly like a wild animal. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw from thirst, and yet she pushed forward because to stop meant surrender, and she had survived too much already to lay down now. Her name was Clara, though she hadn't spoken it aloud in a long time. Names were for people who belonged somewhere. A woman like her, cast adrift, forgotten, left to fend for herself, didn't have much use for one. In the towns she passed through, people looked at her, with suspicion, some with pity, others with disdain. She had learned not to ask for more than she thought they might spare. Usually it was nothing. On rare days, she was given a crust of stale bread or a handful of beans too shriveled to sell. Yet she held on to those meager offerings like treasures, not because they satisfied her hunger, but because they reminded her she was still alive. The horizon stretched wide before her, endless fields dotted with cattle, a few scattered groves, and fences that spoke of prosperity she could never imagine. She paused for a moment, squinting into the distance where the land seemed to roll into the sky. A ranch, big, sprawling, alive with the movement of livestock and the creak of wagons, rested there like a fortress of another world. Clara's chest tightened. Such a place was far beyond her reach. People like her were not welcomed into such homes. She knew it from the way others had turned her away before. Still, her body could take no more wandering. Her stomach was empty, her limbs heavy, and her soul hungered not just for food, but for kindness. She wrapped her arms around herself as though the gesture could keep her standing. What would it hurt, she reasoned, to ask for scraps? Nothing more, nothing less. She wasn't after charity, wasn't looking to impose herself, just something to keep her alive another day. As she walked closer, the sounds of the ranch carried on the breeze, cattle lowing, dogs barking, and men's voices calling out as they worked. It was a world full of strength, order, and life, so different from her own scattered existence. For a fleeting second, she imagined what it might feel like to belong to such a place, to have a roof that didn't leak, and a meal that filled her belly. But dreams were dangerous. Dreams hurt when they were broken. So she quickly buried the thought. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Clara's feet ached, but she forced herself down the dirt path leading to the ranch. She rehearsed the words in her head. "I only ask for scraps, sir. Just scraps." Nothing more. No one could fault her for that, could they? Her heart pounded harder the nearer she came. The fences loomed, and beyond them, a life she had never known but longed for without daring to admit it. She pressed a trembling hand to her chest, gathered what little courage she had left, and took her first step toward the ranch gates. It was not hope that carried her forward, but desperation, the kind that drives a soul to risk rejection one more time, even when rejection is all it has ever known. As Clara drew nearer, the sight of the ranch sharpened into focus. What from afar had looked like a mere cluster of fences and barns now unfolded into a sprawling estate, alive with movement and activity. The wooden posts of the corral stood tall and sturdy, weathered by years of sun and storms, yet still strong enough to hold in the restless cattle. Beyond them, she could see the great ranch house, its wide porch lined with rocking chairs, curtains fluttering in the open windows, smoke curling from the chimney as if announcing to all that it was a home where warmth and meals were never lacking. For Clara, who had been without a home for longer than she could remember, the sight was almost painful in its beauty. The neat rows of outbuildings, the rhythmic swing of a blacksmith's hammer somewhere in the distance, the laughter of hired hands as they exchanged jokes between chores, it was a world entirely different from hers. She paused on the dirt road, suddenly hesitant. The place radiated stability, comfort, and a kind of abundance she dared not hope for. Her instinct was to turn away before anyone noticed her. People who owned land like this were seldom kind to strangers, especially ragged ones who looked like they had crawled out of the edges of society. She could already imagine the rancher's stern eyes narrowing at her, his voice cold as he told her to move along. And perhaps, if she lingered too long, he might send a dog after her or a farmhand to chase her away. But hunger has a way of drowning out fear. Her stomach twisted sharply, reminding her that she had gone nearly 2 days with nothing but a few berries she had scavenged along the roadside. She could feel the weakness in her body, the way her legs trembled beneath her, the dizziness that clouded her vision. No matter how much pride she tried to cling to, it could not feed her. Clara drew a shaky breath and forced herself forward, each step crunching on the gravel as though the ground itself wanted to betray her presence. The closer she got, the more details revealed themselves. A horse stood tethered near the barn, its coat glossy and well-groomed, muscles rippling under the late afternoon sun. Chickens scattered near the coop, pecking eagerly at the grain tossed to them. The scent of fresh bread wafted faintly through the air, mingling with the earthy smell of hay and livestock. Her throat tightened at that smell. Bread. She could almost taste it on her tongue, soft, warm, filling. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself imagine holding a slice between her fingers, steam rising from its crust. The image was so vivid it hurt. Children's laughter rang out suddenly from the far side of the house, startling her from her daydream. She looked up and saw a flash of a little girl running across the porch, her braids bouncing as she skipped. Clara froze where she stood. It had been years since she had heard laughter like that, years since she had seen innocence so unspoiled by hardship. Something inside her cracked. She had come here only for scraps, but seeing the home in all its life and warmth, a dangerous longing stirred in her heart. What would it be like to belong somewhere like this? To sit at a table where bread was broken not just to fill the belly, but to share love, to be seen, not as a beggar, but as a person worthy of kindness? She shook her head sharply, chastising herself. Dreams like that weren't for her. She was no better than the dust clinging to her dress, a wanderer whose life had taught her that nothing good lasted. All she could ask for, all she dared to hope for, was a crust of bread tossed her way, or perhaps a corner of the barn where she could rest her head without being pushed out before sunrise. Gathering the last of her courage, Clara stepped closer, until the ranch gate loomed before her. She rested her hand on the rough wood, steadying herself. Her voice trembled even as she rehearsed the words again in her head. I don't ask for much. Only scraps. And with that, she pushed the boss gate open and walked toward the place that would soon change her life in ways she could never have imagined. The creak of the ranch gate was louder than Clara expected. She winced as it groaned against its hinges, as though announcing her presence to the entire world. For a brief second, she almost turned back, but the sound of boots striking hard ground froze her in place. Someone was coming. From around the corner of the barn, a man emerged, tall, broad-shouldered, his frame carrying the strength of someone who'd spent his life working the land. He walked with a measured gait, confident and steady, the kind of stride that belonged to a man who commanded both respect and obedience. His shirt was rolled at the sleeves, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes, and the lines on his weathered face spoke of long days under the sun and nights spent worrying over more than just himself. Clara swallowed hard. This was him, the rancher. The man who owned everything her eyes had just marveled at. The fields, the barns, the house with the bread baking inside. To him, she was nothing more than a stranger standing at his gate, draped in rags, trembling like a thief caught in the act. His gaze swept over her, sharp and assessing. Not cruel, but cautious. The kind of look a man gave when deciding whether the figure before him was danger, nuisance, or simply lost. He stopped a few feet away, boots grinding against the dirt, and crossed his arms across his chest. "You're far from town," he said, his voice steady, carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "What brings you out this way?" Clara's throat tightened. She had rehearsed this moment 100 times on the road, but now, faced with the weight of his eyes, her words tangled inside her. She lowered her gaze to the dust at her feet, twisting her fingers into the hem of her dress. I don't mean trouble," she whispered, her voice so faint the wind nearly stole it away. "I only ask for scraps, sir. Just scraps." The silence that followed stretched like a rope drawn, taut. Clara dared not look up. She could feel the heat of his gaze, as if he were peeling away the layers of her story without her uttering a word. Her heart pounded in her ears, and every muscle in her body screamed for her to flee. But her hunger anchored her in place. The rancher didn't answer immediately. Instead, he shifted his weight, studying her with a mixture of suspicion and something softer she couldn't quite name. Finally, his voice broke the stillness. "Scraps?" he repeated, almost as if testing the word on his tongue. "That's all you want?" Clara nodded quickly, still staring at the dirt. "Yes, sir. I won't stay long. Just something small. Please." Another pause. She dared a glance upward and saw his brow furrow, his lips pressing into a thoughtful line. It wasn't the outright rejection she had braced for, but it wasn't acceptance either. He was weighing her, measuring the truth of her words, deciding what kind of stranger had wandered onto his land. From behind him, the sound of light footsteps broke the tension. Clara's eyes darted past the rancher to see a small figure bounding. Across the yard, a little girl with sun-browned cheeks and hair tied in 2 playful braids. She clutched a doll in one hand and looked up at her father with wide, curious eyes before turning her gaze on Clara. The child's expression wasn't suspicious or cautious like her father's. It was open, innocent, and filled with the kind of curiosity only children carried. Clara froze, her chest tightening at the sight. The rancher glanced at his daughter, then back at Clara, his jaw tightening as though the presence of the child complicated his thoughts. Finally, he spoke again, his tone low but firm. "I don't take kindly to strangers showing up unannounced," he said, "but I can see you're not here to cause trouble." Clara's breath caught. Was this mercy? Or just a reprieve before? Being turned away? The little girl stepped forward, her doll bouncing against her dress. Without hesitation, she pointed at Clara and asked in a voice sweet and direct, "Papa, who is she?" The rancher's gaze lingered on Clara a moment longer before he finally answered, though his words were more for himself than the child. "Someone who says she only wants scraps." The little girl tilted her head, studying Clara with a seriousness far too deep for her age. Her small fingers clutched her rag doll tightly, but there was no fear in her gaze. Where the rancher's eyes had been sharp, calculating, the girl's were wide and unguarded, like the open sky after a storm. Clara, still standing just inside. The gate lowered her head. She didn't want to frighten the child with her hollow cheeks or the dirt smudged across her skin. Children often shrank away from her, mothers tugging them aside in towns, whispering warnings not to go near the ragged woman who looked like trouble. But this child didn't move back. Instead, she took a step closer, her bare feet patting softly against the packed earth. "Are you hungry?" the little girl asked, her voice gentle, almost secretive, as if she already knew the answer. Clara's throat closed. She didn't know how to reply. The question was too kind, too direct. No one had asked her something so simple in years, as though hunger was a thing too shameful to name aloud. Slowly she nodded. The girl's face brightened, though her father's expression darkened with concern. "Papa," she said, tugging at the rancher's sleeve, "she's hungry. Can't we give her something?" The rancher sighed, running a calloused hand over his jaw. His daughter's voice carried a weight he could not easily ignore. Still, Clara could see the hesitation etched into his features. A stranger at his gate, one who looked worn thin by a hard road, he had every reason to turn her away. But the girl would not let it go. She stepped even closer to Clara now, so near that Clara could see the freckles across her nose, the way her braids had come slightly undone in her play. Then, in a voice so soft, it nearly undid Clara's fragile composure, the girl whispered, "Mama?" The word pierced the silence like a bell ringing across the empty plain. Clara's knees nearly buckled beneath her. No one had ever called her that before. She had no children of her own. Life had robbed her of the chance long ago. She had long since buried that part of herself, convinced she was too broken, too unwanted to ever be anything more than a wanderer. And yet here was a child, looking up at her with eyes that saw not a beggar, not a stranger, but something else entirely. Clara pressed her hand to her chest, her lips trembling. "I'm not," she began, her voice breaking. But the girl only smiled, as though she hadn't heard. The rancher shifted uneasily, his jaw tight. "Now, Sarah," he said gently but firmly, "this woman isn't your mama. She's just passing through." But the little girl shook her head with the stubborn certainty only a child could carry. "She feels like Mama," she said, her small hand reaching out for Clara's. The warmth of that touch startled Clara more than anything else. For so long she had been untouched, avoided, brushed aside, treated as though she carried some invisible stain. But this child's fingers wrapped around hers without hesitation, without judgment. The simple contact sent a wave of emotion crashing through her chest. The rancher's eyes flickered, caught between the sight of his daughter's hand and the stranger's and the unspoken plea in Clara's downcast expression. He looked as though he wanted to pull his daughter back, yet something in his stance softened. "Sarah," he said again, quieter now, "sometimes people come into our lives only for a little while. We have to be careful." The girl only squeezed, Clara's hand tighter, her small chin lifting defiantly. "But sometimes," she answered with innocent wisdom, "God sends them because we need them." The rancher said nothing to that. His silence stretched heavy between them. Clara could not speak. Tears threatened to spill down her cheeks, but she blinked them back, afraid to show weakness. She had asked only for scraps, but in the child's single word, Mama, she had been given something more dangerous, hope, and hope, Clara knew, could break a person even faster than hunger. The world seemed to narrow around Clara in that instant, as if time itself held its breath. The child's small hand clung to hers, fragile yet unshakable, and the words still echoed in the air between them. "Mama." Clara's lips parted, but no sound came. She had endured hunger, cold, and rejection, yet nothing had ever pierced her like that single word from the lips of a child who didn't even know her name. It felt like the earth had shifted under her feet, pulling her into a place she did not belong but longed for all the same. Her first instinct was to correct the girl, to explain she wasn't her mother, that she wasn't anyone's mother. But the look in the child's eyes stopped her. Wide, innocent, and brimming with trust, they were eyes that had never yet learned to doubt the goodness of strangers. To tear herself away from that gaze felt impossible. The rancher, however, reacted swiftly. His hand rested firmly on his daughter's shoulder, his voice low but steady. "Sarah," he said, his tone lined with a father's caution, "this lady isn't your mama. Don't go calling her that." But Sarah didn't flinch under his words. Her grip on Clara's hand only tightened, her chin lifting in the stubborn defiance only a child could muster. "She feels like Mama," she insisted, softly, her eyes never leaving Clara's. Clara's chest constricted. She wanted to drop to her knees, to pull the little girl into her arms, to weep into her braids as though she could pour out years of loneliness into the embrace of a child who didn't understand what she had given her with that single word. But she didn't dare. She was still a stranger here, standing on another's land, her future hanging by the thin thread of the rancher's decision. She forced her trembling lips to move. "I'm not—" Her voice cracked and she tried again. "I'm not your mama, child." Sarah only tilted her head, thoughtful in a way that seemed far too wise for her years. "Maybe not. But you feel like her." The rancher's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking between his daughter and the stranger before him. Clara saw the battle in his gaze, his instinct to protect his child clashing with the tenderness that lingered at the edges of his stern expression. "Enough now, Sarah," he said, though his voice lacked the sharpness it might have carried. He looked back at Clara, and she braced herself for rejection, for the inevitable words that would send her away. "Leave. Move along. We've no room for the likes of you." Instead, he surprised her. "You said you wanted scraps," he murmured, his tone unreadable. "Come to the porch. You can have a meal. Then you'll be on your way." The words were both mercy and dismissal, but Clara clung to the first part of them as though they were lifelines. A meal, not scraps tossed from a back door, but a meal offered in his presence. It was more than she had hoped for, though not as much as the child seemed to want. Sarah, however, beamed. "See, Papa? She can stay." Clara's heart twisted. Stay. The word was dangerous, a dream she couldn't afford. She lowered her eyes quickly, afraid the longing in them would betray her. "I'll eat what you give," she whispered, "and I'll be gone by morning." The rancher studied her in silence, his expression guarded. Sarah frowned, clearly displeased with the bargain, and leaned against Clara's side as though she had already claimed her. The weight of that small body against her rags was almost unbearable in its sweetness. Clara didn't dare return the embrace, but she didn't step away either. In that moment, she realized something. She had walked onto this land asking only for scraps. But she had been given something she had never thought she would touch again. Not bread, not shelter. Hope. And hope, though fragile, was enough to keep her standing as she followed father and daughter toward the porch, her heart trembling with a word she would never forget. Mama. The porch boards creaked beneath their steps as the rancher led the way to the house. Clara followed at a careful distance, her head bowed, her heart racing with every step closer to the doorway. She had never imagined herself here, inside a home like this, where the smell of warm bread and roasted meat drifted out through the open windows, where laughter lingered in the very wood. It was a place built on more than wealth. It was built on roots, on belonging. And that was what terrified her most. The rancher opened the screen door and held it long enough for Clara to step inside. She hesitated, her bare toes curling against the edge of the porch, afraid to cross the threshold. Homes like this weren't meant for people like her. She half expected the man to slam the door shut to tell her he'd changed his mind, but Sarah, the little girl, solved that hesitation. With her small hand still tangled in Clara's, she tugged her inside with the fearlessness only a child could possess. "Come on, Mama," she said brightly. Clara's chest tightened, her breath hitching. She didn't correct her this time. She couldn't. Inside, the air was cool compared to the dry heat outside. The wide front room was tidy but lived in, with a big hearth at one end and shelves lined with books and trinkets at the other. A braided rug softened the floorboards, and the table in the dining area was already set with mismatched plates and sturdy cutlery. The scent of food was stronger here, so much so that Clara's knees nearly buckled. The rancher cleared his throat, breaking the silence. "Sit," he said simply, nodding toward a chair at the far end of the table. His voice was steady, but his eyes lingered on her in quiet scrutiny. Clara obeyed, moving carefully, as though afraid to disturb the neatness of the room. She lowered herself onto the chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed, on the table rather than the man who owned it. Sarah clambered up into the chair beside her, swinging her legs cheerfully. "Can she stay, Papa? Can she?" The rancher's jaw flexed as he set bread and a pot of stew down on the table. "She'll eat," he answered. "Then she'll rest. Tomorrow she'll move on." Clara flinched, though she tried to hide it. His words were fair, more than fair, but hearing them spoken aloud carved into her heart. Move on. It was what she had always done, what life had demanded of her. And yet, after one word from a child, after one brief hand clasp, she found herself wishing for something more dangerous than survival. She found herself wishing to stay. The meal began in silence. Clara ate slowly, though every instinct screamed at her to devour the food. She didn't want to appear greedy. She took small bites, savoring each one as though it might be her last. The stew was thick with vegetables and tender meat, the bread soft and warm against her tongue. Tears stung, her eyes at the taste. It wasn't just food, it was care, a reminder of what she had gone without for too long. The rancher watched her quietly, one hand resting on the table, his eyes unreadable. Sarah, on the other hand, chattered happily, telling Clara about her pony, about the chickens she helped feed, about the flowers she had planted out back. She slipped easily into conversation as if Clara had always been there, as if her presence at the table wasn't strange at all. Clara listened, nodding gently, murmuring little responses. She dared not speak too much. She was painfully aware of the tension lingering in the room, the way the rancher's gaze never quite left her, the way his daughter's joy seemed to both soften and unsettle him. Finally, as Sarah leaned against Clara's arm with a yawn, the rancher broke the quiet. "You said you'd be gone by morning," he reminded her, his voice firm, though not unkind. Clara lowered her spoon, her eyes falling to the half-empty bowl. "Yes, sir. I'll be gone by sunrise. You have my word." Sarah frowned, her small hands clutching at Clara's sleeve. "But Papa—" "Enough, Sarah." His tone was gentle, but it carried finality. The girl pouted but said no more. Clara forced a small smile down at her, though her heart ached. "Don't worry, little one. I won't trouble your papa long." The child's gaze softened and she whispered almost stubbornly, "You're not trouble. You're Mama." The words hung in the air again, heavier this time, impossible to ignore. The rancher's eyes flicked between them, his daughter's innocent certainty and the stranger's fragile, pleading silence. For the first time in years, Clara prayed, not for scraps, not for shelter, but for a place at this table, a place in this home. The night passed in a blur of restless dreams for Clara. Though the rancher had given her a blanket and a corner of the porch to sleep, she barely closed her eyes. Every creak of the house, every stir of the wind made her heart leap, half afraid she would be shaken awake and told to leave after all. But dawn came quietly, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, and she was still there, hungry, weary, but alive. When the rooster crowed, Clara rose before anyone else stirred. She couldn't repay the meal she had been given, not with money, but she knew another kind of currency: work. Work was the only thing she had ever been good at, the only way she had managed to survive the towns that had cast her aside. She found her way to the pump out back, filled a bucket, and scrubbed her, face clean in the cold water. The reflection that blinked back at her was haggard, worn thin, but for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of purpose in her eyes. Without waiting for permission, she began to tidy. She gathered the fallen kindling near the woodpile, stacked it neatly, swept the porch clear of dust, and even mended the loose hinge on the gate with a piece of wire she found near the barn. Her hands moved with a steady rhythm, finding comfort in the familiarity of labor. Every stroke of the broom, every task completed, whispered to her heart, "Maybe if I show my worth, they'll let me stay just one more day." By the time the sun had risen high enough to bathe the ranch in full light, the rancher stepped out onto the porch. He stopped short, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene: the swept boards, the tidy woodpile, the repaired gate. And there was Clara, on her knees beside the steps, scrubbing at a stubborn stain in the wood with a rag. She froze when she felt his gaze, her fingers tightening around the cloth. Slowly, she turned her face upward, bracing herself for anger. "You weren't told to do that," he said, his voice unreadable. Clara lowered her eyes. "I wasn't told not to." The rancher's brows lifted slightly, though his expression remained stern. "Why?" Her answer came without hesitation, though her voice trembled. "Because I can't just take. I need to give back something, even if it's only a little." A silence stretched between them, heavy as the morning air. Then, from inside, Sarah's bright voice carried through the open door. "Papa, where's Mama?" Clara's breath hitched, her knuckles whitening around the rag. The rancher glanced back toward the house, his jaw tight, before returning his gaze to Clara. He didn't correct his daughter this time, not aloud. Instead, he asked quietly, "What else can you do?" It was not a dismissal. It was not a command. To leave. It was, Clara realized with a jolt, a question, one that opened a door she hadn't dared imagine. Her voice steadied as she answered. "I can cook, sew, tend animals. I've worked fields, mended fences. I'm no stranger to hard labor." The rancher's eyes studied her, weighing the truth of her words. Finally, he gave a slow nod. "The hands'll be in soon. We'll see how much work you're truly willing to put in." Clara's chest swelled with a strange mix of fear and relief. It wasn't acceptance, not yet, but it wasn't rejection either. It was a chance. And that was more than she had expected when she'd stepped onto this land begging for scraps. That day, Clara worked harder than she ever had before. She gathered eggs with Sarah at her side, mended torn shirts for the ranch hands, kneaded bread with the housekeeper, and even carried buckets of water to the barn. Every task left her more exhausted, but also more alive. The rancher watched quietly from a distance, his expression never softening, but never turning her away. And when Sarah fell asleep that night with her small hand wrapped around Clara's, Clara allowed herself just for a moment to believe she might have earned not just scraps, but a place. It didn't take long for word to spread. Ranches were like small towns. Every new face was noticed, every whisper carried faster than the wind. By the end of Clara's second day at the ranch, neighbors and hired hands alike had begun to murmur about the ragged woman who had shown up out of nowhere. Some of the whispers were laced with pity. "Poor thing," one ranch hand muttered to another, watching Clara scrub clothes by the well. "Looks like she's had more than her share of trouble. Ain't no harm in letting her earn her bread." Others were not so kind. "Strays don't just wander in for no reason," another said darkly. "Mark my words, she's running from something. Maybe the law. Maybe worse." Clara heard the whispers, though no one spoke them directly to her face. She pretended not to, keeping her head down, focusing on the work. She stitched shirts until her fingers ached, swept the porch until her arms were sore, and cooked stew that filled the house with warmth. Outwardly, she was steady. Inwardly, the whispers gnawed at her like hungry wolves. She had worked so hard to bury her past, to silence the memories that haunted her steps. Yet here, among strangers, the past felt closer than ever. Every time someone's eyes lingered on her too long, every time voices hushed when she entered a room, Clara felt the weight of her history pressing down on her chest. It was Sarah who saved her from collapsing under that weight. The little girl shadowed her like a sunbeam, darting at her heels, chattering about the ponies, the hens, the wildflowers growing by the creek. "Mama, watch me run!" she'd call, sprinting across the yard. Or, "Mama, help me braid my doll's hair." Each time, Clara's heart both ached and healed. She had never been called that word before arriving here, yet Sarah said it with such certainty, as if the bond had been there all along, waiting to be discovered. Still, the whispers outside grew louder. By the end of the week, the rancher himself began to hear them when he went into town. At the general store, a man leaned in and asked, "You sure it's wise, taking in some stray? Folks say she don't talk about where she's from." Another chimed in, "Could be trouble. You got a daughter to think of." The rancher gave no answers. He was a man of few words, and what he thought, he kept to himself. But Clara saw the shift in his eyes when he looked at her, more questions lingering there, a sharper edge to his watchfulness. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in gold, Clara sat on the porch steps with Sarah nestled against her side. The girl had fallen asleep mid-story, her doll slipping from her hand. Clara brushed a strand of hair from her forehead, marveling at the innocence of her trust. The rancher stepped out then, leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed. His gaze settled on Clara, then drifted to his daughter. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, he asked, "What is it you're running from?" Clara's breath caught. The words struck deeper than any whisper. She wanted to deny it, to say she wasn't running, that she had simply wandered too far, that her story was nothing worth telling. But his eyes held her still, steady and unflinching. Her lips trembled. "Not running," she whispered finally. "Just left behind." It was the closest she had come to speaking the truth in years. Memories pressed hard against her chest, of being cast out, of hands that had once held her turning her away, of a life traded for survival. But she swallowed them down. The rancher studied her in silence, his expression unreadable. At last, he gave a small nod as though her answer, incomplete as it was, would suffice for now. Then he turned his gaze to his sleeping daughter, a softness flickering briefly across his stern features. "Sarah trusts you," he said. "That counts. For something?" Clara lowered her head, tears stinging her eyes. For all the whispers that sought to drag her past into the open, it was the child's faith and the rancher's reluctant acknowledgement that gave her strength to face another day. She had come seeking only scraps. But now, with every passing moment, she feared and hoped in equal measure that she was finding something far more dangerous, a place where she might finally belong. The rancher had always prided himself on being a man who made decisions quickly and firmly. Life on the land didn't allow hesitation, cattle didn't wait, storms didn't linger politely, and men who faltered often lost more than they gained. But when it came to Clara, the stranger who had wandered onto his ranch begging for scraps, his certainty faltered. Each evening, after the work was done and the sun melted into the horizon, he found himself watching her. She moved quietly, never asking for more than was given, yet she carried herself with a quiet dignity. He had seen her fingers raw from mending shirts, her back bent from hauling water, her eyes soft whenever Sarah slipped her small hand into hers. and Sarah, his daughter, his joy, his responsibility, had taken to Clara as if she had always belonged. She clung to her at mealtimes, followed her through chores, even begged to have her tuck her in at night. It unsettled him. It frightened him, if he was honest. His little girl had never known her mother. She had passed when Sarah was only a babe, and in Clara she seemed to have found what had always been missing. But what if the whispers were true? What if Clara carried secrets that could harm them? The weight of that question pressed on him day after day. Neighbors cautioned him, ranch hands muttered behind his back, and still Sarah's voice rang through the house. "Mama, come see." "Mama, read to me." The more the child called Clara by that forbidden word, the harder it became for him to pretend the woman was only passing through. One night, long after Sarah had drifted to sleep, the rancher sat at the kitchen table, staring into a half-empty cup of coffee. Clara was in the next room, patching a quilt by lamplight. He could hear the steady pull of her needle, the soft sigh she released with each stitch. It was the sound of someone trying to mend more than fabric, someone trying to mend herself. He rubbed a hand over his jaw, torn between two instincts. As a father, he wanted to shield his daughter from disappointment. As a man, he wanted to believe in what he saw with his own eyes, that Clara was not a threat, but a blessing. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but carrying across the quiet room. "Clara," she paused, lifting her head slowly, wary of the tone in his voice. "Yes, sir?" He gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." She obeyed, smoothing the quilt across her lap, her eyes lowered. He studied her for a long while. "I've let you stay longer than I meant to," he said. "Longer than I should have." Her fingers twisted into the fabric, her breath shallow. She opened her mouth to speak, but he raised a hand. "Sarah, she's taken to you." "More than I expected. More than I know how to handle." His voice softened on that last line, though his gaze remained steady. "But I need to know where. You stand. If you mean to leave, I'd rather you do it now than let her grow more attached." Clara's throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything, that she had no place to go, no family waiting, no home anywhere but here. She wanted to beg him, to let her stay, not for her sake, but for Sarah's. Yet fear held her tongue. Finally, she whispered, "I never meant to stay. I only asked for scraps. But your daughter—" Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her chest. "She gave me something I didn't even know I needed." The rancher's eyes narrowed slightly, searching her face for falsehood. He saw only sincerity. Fragile, desperate sincerity. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long breath. "You can stay," he said at last. Clara's head jerked up, her eyes wide. "But," he continued firmly, "not as a beggar, not as a stranger. If you're to be here, you'll work, you'll pull your weight, and you'll respect this home." His tone carried no room for argument, yet there was no cruelty in it, only resolution. Clara's lips trembled as she nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "I will. I promise." For the first time in years, the rancher felt the tension in his chest ease. It wasn't an easy decision, and he knew it would come with consequences. But as he thought of his daughters, laughter, of the way she looked at Clara with unshakable trust, he knew he had made the only choice he could. Clara had never known what it felt like to belong. Her life until now had been a collection of scraps. Scraps of food, scraps of kindness, scraps of hope. She had learned to survive on the edges of other people's worlds, never daring to step into the warmth of their hearths. Yet now, here, she was, living day by day in a place that felt less like a mercy and more like a miracle. The days fell into a rhythm. At dawn, Clara rose with the rancher and the hands, preparing breakfast that filled the house with the scent of coffee and biscuits. She worked beside them, gathering eggs, tending the garden, patching shirts and saddles alike. When evening came, she sat with Sarah in her lap, reading aloud until the girl's eyelids fluttered closed. Each task was simple, but each carried weight, a small thread stitching her more firmly into the fabric of the ranch. The rancher said little, as was his way, but she began to notice small shifts in him. Where once his eyes had been wary, now they held quiet trust. Where once he spoke to her only out of necessity, now he asked her thoughts on matters of the home, what seeds to plant, how best to keep Sarah's dresses mended. He didn't smile, often, but when he did, it was usually after Sarah said something that made them both laugh, and Clara found herself smiling back. Still, she never forgot the fragility of her place. The whispers hadn't vanished, neighbors still cast suspicious glances, and the ranch hands sometimes muttered about how strange it was to have her there. But when those doubts pressed heavy on her, Sarah's voice would cut through the gloom. "Mama, help me," or "Mama, watch." That single word, Mama, anchored Clara in a way nothing else ever had. One Sunday evening, as the family gathered on the porch to watch the sunset, Sarah climbed into Clara's lap with a tired sigh. The little girl's head nestled against her chest, her small fingers curling into the folds of Clara's apron. "Do you have to go away someday?" Sarah asked sleepily, her voice muffled against her. Clara froze, her heart thudding painfully. She looked toward the rancher, uncertain how to answer. He met her gaze steadily. For a long moment, silence stretched between them, filled only by the chirping of crickets. Then, with a rare softness, he spoke. "She's not going anywhere. Sarah." The girl smiled faintly, already half asleep. "Good," she murmured, before drifting off. Clara's throat tightened, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She pressed a kiss to Sarah's hair, the weight of the rancher's words settling deep within her. He hadn't said it lightly. He wasn't a man to make promises without meaning them. It wasn't just Sarah he was speaking to. It was her. From that day forward, something shifted. Clara stopped moving as if the ground beneath her might give way. She began humming softly while she worked, letting laughter slip past her lips when Sarah teased or the rancher made a dry remark. She dared to set her few belongings neatly in a drawer rather than keeping them tied in a bundle, ready to flee. Slowly, carefully, she began to believe she had found a home. One evening, weeks later, she set a loaf of fresh bread on the table. Sarah clapped her hands with delight, declaring it the best Mama's ever made. The rancher reached for a slice, and though he said nothing, Clara caught the flicker of pride in his eyes. It was then she realized. She had come to the ranch begging for scraps. Scraps of food, scraps of shelter, scraps of mercy. But what she had been given was far greater. She had been given a place at the table, a child's trust, a man's respect, and something that might, in time, grow into love. For the first time in her life, Clara was not surviving on scraps. She was living, fully, deeply, and with a family, who had chosen her as much as she had chosen them. And as the sun dipped low over the wide open land, Clara held Sarah close and whispered to herself the truth she had long been afraid to believe. "I am home."